The husband returned from the battlefield and brought back the princess of the enemy country. Shang, I'm sorry to have to put you in such a difficult position for the sake of friendship between our two countries. Overnight, I was demoted to a concubine and became the laughingstock of the entire capital. Late at night, the emperor crouched beside my ear, holding my feet and playing with them carefully. My dear madam, how do I compare to your husband?
1.
Be good. Your husband is outside the door. Do you want me to call him in? In the gilded palace filled with faint fragrance, embroidered shoes and clothes were scattered all over the floor. Don't. I pleaded cautiously. He sneered in response. What do you think he's going to do? I didn't say anything. The person outside is my husband, Ji Cheng. He came to ask for the imperial physician for the princess of the enemy country. The princess is now 3 months pregnant, and every now and then she asks him to ask the imperial physician to check her pulse. Ji Cheng's voice suddenly came from outside the screen. Your Majesty, I have another unwelcome request. Xiaoyu paused, but didn't let me go. He said coldly, Speak. The princess is pregnant and cannot stand any stimulation. I beg your Majesty to issue an order to give her a status. Xiaoyu raised his eyebrows slightly, staring at me with a half-smile. General Ji, your wife has been your wife for many years. Are you really willing to let her go? Ji Cheng said in a calm voice, I have no feelings for Yunyang anymore. I am her concubine, and I am doing her justice. I hope your Majesty will grant my wish. My whole body froze, staring at the figure outside the screen in disbelief. He clearly said that he and the princess of the enemy country were just acting. Xiaoyu laughed, peeled away my hand that was begging for mercy, and whispered, I heard it. He wants you to be his concubine. No one can compare to me. I can give you whatever you want. I will be discovered. I don't want to sink into the pond. Xiaoyu laughed out loud. Look how tired you are. You are talking nonsense. I am here. Who dares to let you sink into the pond? I have always been honest and dutiful, so I silently hugged Xiaoyu's neck tightly. He understood what I meant, smiled coldly, and said to the husband outside the door, Okay. The gold pins on the temples made a lively clanging sound. I kept crying during the second half. Xiaoyu softened his tone and coaxed me. He is blind, so we should just throw it away. Then can you make me the queen? Asking this question was meant to force him to give up the idea. Who knew Xiaoyu would sneer and say, It's not that difficult. I can give you whatever you want. In the past, there were rumors that Xiaoyu was a madman who killed his mother and father and did all kinds of evil. The Empress Dowager has remained vacant until now, and no one dares to marry their daughter to him. I didn't expect he could be so crazy.
2.
In late spring, the crabapple blossoms outside the window are in clusters. I fainted at Xiaoyu's place, and when I woke up, I was back at the general's mansion. Princess Suaningxi came to see me specially. She looks different from people in the Central Plains, with 3-dimensional and bright features. It is a very beautiful appearance. I heard that the general went to great lengths to marry you. I held the teacup and remained silent. Indeed. In order to marry me, Ji Cheng knelt in the snow and was beaten all over by his father. Again in the middle of the night, he hugged me tightly and said that he would never leave me. Suaningxi touched her belly and said with a smile, But now, Jiangjun and I both have a child. The general was young at the time and didn't know what he liked. For example, when I first met him on the battlefield, he wanted to kill me. Suaningxi laughed as he spoke. Love and hate each other, but in the end, it all turns into tenderness around fingers. I felt like a needle was stabbed in my heart. The pain started to come in spasms. The day Ji Cheng brought Suaningxi back, he swore with anger in his eyes. If it weren't for the friendship between our two countries, I would have killed that bastard with my own hands. Later, I saw him having sex with Suaningxi. You acted like a bitch first, and now you still have the nerve to cry? Ji Cheng chuckled and teased without any gnashing of teeth. Suaningxi cried and acted coquettishly. The general doesn't like it? Then just kill me, and it will be over once and for all. How can I bear to? Ji Cheng sighed softly and took her to hide in the sea of flowers. Then I realized that Ji Cheng really fell in love with her. Before Suaning left, he stood by the door and said in a boastful manner, "My union with the general is what everyone wants. I hope you can understand what is the righteousness of the country and family."
3.
On the Qiqiao festival, Ji Cheng took Suaning to attend the palace banquet. I was sitting in the patio, looking at the stars in the sky, when suddenly someone landed next to me. Ambergris floated slowly in the breeze. "Keep your head up, the weaving star is behind you." The voice was very distinctive, clear yet majestic. You don't need to look back to know who it is. I didn't look in the direction he told me to. Instead, I lowered my head, looking unhappy. Why watch knitting actresses? You'll still fall apart after watching them. Xiaoyu sneered. Whether to disperse or not is up to me. I was in a bad mood. After a long while, I turned to look at Xiaoyu and asked, "Can you take me into the palace?" "What?" "Go see Ji Cheng." "I think I understand now. Ji Cheng and I have come this far, and our fate has come to an end. With his colleagues as witnesses, tonight is the most appropriate night to part with him." Xiaoyu stroked the jade ring, stared at me for a long time and suddenly smiled. "Okay." Just like that, I got on the carriage to the palace. I have been here several times before and know my way around the palace. Xiaoyu led me into the carriage and turned into an unfamiliar alley. "Your Majesty, this." His chin was suddenly pinched by him, and Xiaoyu curled his lips coldly. "Do you think I will let you be affectionate with Ji Cheng? Have you forgotten what you said when you slept with me?" My heart shuddered, my cheeks flushed, and I felt ashamed. The day I saw Ji Cheng and Suaning making love, I was drugged. Losing his mind, he knocked a man down by mistake, thinking he was Ji Cheng. "He is Xiaoyu. I still remember the conversation we had." "Madam, you have the wrong person." "Don't talk. What if you don't admit your mistake when you wake up? If you don't want to admit it, then don't admit it. I won't reason with you." At this moment, Xiaoyu's amber eyes were staring at me leisurely. "You treat me as a substitute and throw me away after trying me. This is called starting with chaos and then giving up in the end." I huddled in a corner, feeling myself enveloped by his refreshing breath, my hands helplessly climbing onto his shoulders. "Wait, there's someone. What we want is people." 4. Xiaoyu set up a screen in the middle of the banquet. The ministers outside could vaguely see the hazy figure inside. He brought me to the palace banquet in such a grand manner. I was so nervous that my palms were sweating. Just as I was about to speak, Xiaoyu made a gesture to silence me. He can hear it. Only then did I realize that on the lower right were Ji Cheng and Suaning. The sound of Ji Cheng's soft breathing could be heard through the screen. "Stop making trouble," he said in a low voice, and the last word of his voice suddenly tightened. Suaning said coquettishly, "No, I'm not full yet. It's against the rules." Although it is a rebuke, it is also full of tolerance. Xiaoyu hugged me, leaned close to my ear, and whispered, "What do you want to eat? I'll pick it up for you." These words brought the movement on the other side to an abrupt halt. Ji Cheng stood up suddenly. "I pay my respects to your Majesty." "Yes, thank you," Xiaoyu said in a cold tone. "Today is a family dinner. Please feel free to do as you please, my dears." After saying this, he reminded me without hesitation, "There are a lot of bones in that fish. Let me pick them out for you." After he finished speaking, there was silence all around. Several old officials stood up excitedly. "May I ask your Majesty, whose daughter is this in the tent?" Xiaoyu chuckled. "Come to think of it, I have quite a connection with General Ji. The Ji family has many branches, and even Ji Cheng may not remember how many sisters he has. It turns out she is General Ji's cousin." A group of old ministers did their best to persuade Emperor Xiaoyu to establish the queen. Xiaoyu, on the other hand, turned a deaf ear to what was happening outside, lowered his eyes, and patiently provoked me. With those beautiful hands, only the white and tender fish meat was left on the plate. I was terrified and drank glass after glass of fruit wine on the table without realizing it. By the time you feel the wind blowing, it's already too late. Xiaoyu held onto my shaky body and said, "Are you not worried that I will abandon you?" I leaned softly in his arms, My nose felt sore, and tears started to fall. Outside the screen, Suaningshi started to have a bad temper. We must also accept Ji Cheng's criticism of him. Ji Cheng had never been able to pick things out cleanly before, but this time, he actually became skilled at it. Xiaoyu lowered his eyes, looked at my wet eyes, suddenly held my cheeks, lowered his head, and bit my neck. The force is slightly heavier. In panic, I suddenly cried out. The whispers next door stopped abruptly. Your Majesty, that woman just now. Xiaoyu smiled indifferently and said, It's okay. She is young and can't stand the torture. Ji Cheng seemed a little hesitant. He was silent for a moment and sat back. I was so scared that I buried my head tightly in Xiaoyu's arms, fearing that the screen would suddenly fall down and reveal my panicked face. Xiaoyu chuckled and said, I'll be back first. You guys can do as you please. He picked me up, and when he turned around, the screen suddenly groaned dangerously. Ji Cheng stood up again and looked over here. I felt something was wrong and lowered my head immediately. After a few breaths, the screen collapsed with a loud bang. When the smoke cleared, Xiaoyu hugged me and was exposed to everyone.
5.
The room was dead silent. No one would have thought that I had made Xiaoyu's clothes disheveled, and he no longer looked like an emperor.
Boom.
It was the sound of the wine table being knocked over. Ji Cheng stumbled forward. Your Majesty, why is this woman? I was so scared that I broke out in a cold sweat and lowered my head to hug Xiaoyu tightly. His rapid breathing dripped down Xiaoyu's neck. Suddenly, the golden hairpin on her head loosened, and her black hair fell down instantly. Xiaoyu grabbed the back of my head and held me tightly in his arms. General Ji, you have overstepped your bounds. Ji Cheng refused to give up. May I ask your Majesty, how old is this woman? Which sister of my clan is she? Xiaoyu was in a good mood after hearing this. Why? General Ji wants to act as a matchmaker for me. Or, as an elder brother is like a father, I will arrange this happy event today. Ji Cheng choked up. I am afraid that someone with ill intentions may use my name to harm your Majesty. Please be merciful and allow me to take a look at her appearance. A group of old officials echoed. General Ji is right. Your Majesty, you should be careful in everything. I feel very confused. Xiaoyu is moody. Maybe he's just playing a trick on me. If you really get tired of playing, throw me out. Xiaoyu lowered his head and whispered to me. Did you hear me? They want me to hand you over. Do you want me to agree? Don't want it. Xiaoyu said calmly. If you don't want it, then just say something nice. I'll be happy to hear that, and I'll do as you say. Good words. Xiaoyu smiled and said, Please beg me. I whispered, Please. Is that all you want to say? He rubbed my fingertips and whispered, Is your life not worth a few words of intimacy? I knew what he wanted to hear, but I was so nervous that I couldn't utter a word. Xiaoyu smiled and raised his head. It's inconvenient today, let's all go. Several old ministers were determined and stood before Xiaoyu to give him a last-ditch warning. Your Majesty, today, please give us old ministers a reassurance. Ji Cheng stood in the front and vowed not to give in. Xiaoyu sneered and suddenly pinched my lower back lightly. I shivered and gasped. The noisy crowd immediately shut up. Did you hear that? Xiaoyu raised his eyelids and glanced at everyone. Do you want to come into my bridal chamber? I'm really anxious. Most of the ministers were over 50 years old, and they blushed and kept muttering, This is offensive to public morals. They probably have never seen anyone as shameless as Xiaoyu in their lives. I have failed to live up to the trust placed in me by the late emperor. Some even went worse and started to cry and scream. Xiaoyu ignored me, hugged me, and walked away through the crowd. When he reached a deserted place, Xiaoyu stopped and said, Okay, how long are you going to hide? I slipped out of his arms. Before he could stand firmly, he suddenly turned his head and stumbled out. Yunshang, Xiaoyu shouted, took a few quick steps, grabbed my arm, and dragged me back. Why are you running? I was so drunk and scared that I couldn't speak clearly. I'm going to be immersed in a pig cage. Xiaoyu laughed angrily. What are you doing? There were 2 lines of coldness flowing down my cheeks, and my voice was sobbing, like a female ghost who died unjustly. I'm not clean anymore. I have an adulterer. Xiaoyu's face darkened. Do you think I'm dirty? He lifted me up, pinched my cheek, and said viciously, Open your eyes and look. Who do you think is the adulterer? I burped and cried even harder. Oh God, please spare my life. Xiaoyu did not comfort me, but instead put on a nice smile and said sinisterly, What should I do? I will go to the underworld with you to fight against the ghost. As soon as these words were spoken, the eunuchs and palace maids around them fell to their knees. Your Majesty is the Son of Heaven. You must not say such treasonous words. Xiaoyu ignored all this and just stared at my face. Seeing that I was hesitant, he leaned closer and whispered, Think it over. I'm here, and you can reach me with your hands. I'm 1,000 times better than your unfaithful husband. Thinking of the feeling of that night of passion, I can't help but feel nostalgic. After just a moment, he shook his head and changed his mind. No, I want to divorce Ji Cheng first. Do we have to divorce first? Tisk. Xiaoyu's face showed annoyance. The rules are really strict. He waved his hand and said, I will order you. The chief eunuch hurriedly brought the items, including pen, ink, paper, and inkstone. Xiaoyu lowered his eyes, wrote 2 or 3 times, threw down the pen, and stamped his name. Okay, divorce. He casually threw the imperial edict into the arms of the chief eunuch, grabbed my curious body, and pulled me back. Are you okay with me now? I am free. I couldn't believe it. Yes. Xiaoyu said briefly, and took me into the sedan chair. Along the way, I didn't react. He leaned forward and looked straight into the eunuch's arms. After entering the bedroom, I asked again, Is your imperial edict more effective than the divorce letter? Xiaoyu lowered his head and carefully untied my belt. Just as I was feeling happy, Xiaoyu's hand went through my underwear and into my clothes. Shang, when will you give me a name? I stared at his charmingly handsome face and touched it. Adulterer. Audace. Before he could finish his words, Xiaoyu forcefully threw him into the tent. Stop talking. 6. When I woke up, the room was filled with ambergris mist. I turned over and felt as if all the flesh on my body was no longer my own. While getting dressed, she accidentally knocked over the teacup, startling the palace maids outside. They flocked in, calling me mother respectfully. I asked cautiously, Where did the lady come from? His Majesty conferred the title personally this morning. Thinking of the scene last night, my face flushed immediately, and I was frightened again, so I asked, Where's the imperial edict? Your Majesty, you may not know that the imperial edict Your Majesty wrote last night was rejected by the Secretariat. They said it would shake the morale of the army and would be detrimental to governing the country. This morning, His Majesty went to the study early because of this matter. My thoughts were in a mess, and I suddenly felt that my life was in danger. He immediately put on his clothes and went to Xiaoyu's study. On the way, I heard someone say, Several senior ministers are now following General Ji to the general's mansion. They are determined to dig deep into the ground to find the woman from yesterday. What will happen if we dig it out? If she has a good background, she will naturally be made queen. If she has a bad background, she will be shoveled away to prevent future troubles. I felt a chill run down my spine and couldn't move forward a step. The man said, Who dares to disobey the new emperor? The new emperor has the final say on paper, but the real power is still in the hands of a few elders. It's not his turn to say no. I looked ashen. Finished. It's all over. Xiaoyu has no real power at all. It's better to escape early. When I turned around, I saw Xiaoyu's personal eunuch standing respectfully behind me. I hurriedly said, I have something important to get from the general's mansion. Please take me there, eunuch. 7. Xiaoyu was tied up by someone, and the people around him did not dare to disobey me, so they quickly sent me to the general's mansion. Just as I breathed a sigh of relief, Ji Cheng arrived. Shang, where did you go last night? My palms were sweating with nervousness. I didn't go anywhere. He looked me over carefully with his dark eyes and suddenly said to himself, "Yes, you look like this. I am just overthinking it." He suddenly raised his hand and held my face. "Shang, I'm too busy recently, don't blame me. I'll accompany you when I'm free." The tone of like tone touched the pain in my heart. I avoided his touch and said, "Since you have already fallen in love with someone else, let's just get divorced. I want to leave the capital. Can you return my mother's belongings to me?" Before my mother died, she left a jade pendant as a token of love for her son-in-law. That jade pendant is still in Ji Cheng's possession. Shang, what are you talking about? Ji Cheng frowned. "I don't have time to argue with you now. His Majesty has taken a fancy to my cousin, and now my colleagues are anxious for me to find out her identity. Please don't make trouble with me." I remembered that morning when they threatened to execute me, and my heart tightened. I dared not slack off. "Give me the remains and I'll leave right away." Ji Cheng closed his eyes, his fatigue clearly visible. Shang, no one wants a divorced woman. Every family has 3 wives and 4 concubines. With your background, it is not a disgrace for you to be my concubine. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Ji Cheng made a solemn vow. "You are my daughter-in-law for life. I will listen to whatever you say." But he has changed now. Now that I had said something he didn't want to hear, Ji Cheng left without looking back. There is no reason for me to stay in this place anymore. After packing my bags, I walked to the door alone, but was bumped into by Ningxi, who was coming back from shopping. Her maid grabbed my collar and dragged me back, saying with a smile, "Where are you going?" She knows some martial arts and is quite strong. I pushed her away and said coldly, "Don't touch me." Ningxi laughed out loud. "You Central Plains women are as weak as little chicks. Are you going to cry in front of the general and complain that I bullied you?" The servants around me watched silently as if there was a lot of excitement, and no one spoke up for me. The maid used force and threw me to the ground. I propped myself up and tried to sit up. Unexpectedly, Ningxi lightly lifted her foot, and her embroidered shoes rolled on my shoulder with force. "I heard that you and the general were arguing about divorce? How could a concubine like you have the nerve to ask for a divorce? Her current clothing style is already in line with the standards for a first wife. What a beautiful sight." Just as I was about to speak, Ningxi pinched my chin. She squatted in front of me leisurely and said contemptuously, "You ignorant woman, you don't even understand the situation. The general's cousin is now the favorite of His Majesty, and she will be promoted soon. Unfortunately, you will not be able to enjoy such a good life."
Bah.
I don't want it. After being scolded by me, she sneered and ordered, "Take off her clothes so that she can entertain the distinguished guests coming to the palace on behalf of the general." "Stop. Don't touch me." I had never suffered such humiliation before, and I struggled desperately. The few shrews who attacked me were bitten by me, and they cried out in pain as blood appeared. But there were too many people, and I couldn't defeat them. When Ji Cheng rushed back home, I was being pinned to the ground and having my clothes stripped off. "Stop," he said angrily. I walked forward and kicked away the old slave who was holding me down. The clamp is loosened. I rolled over and lay on the ground, gasping for breath. In his hand was a handful of hair that he had pulled from someone else. Ningxi's momentum suddenly softened. "General, she was the one who insulted me first." The few who took action were also silent. Everyone realized that Ji Cheng was angry. Ji Cheng didn't say anything, but lowered his head and stared at my exposed collarbone, with shock and fear in his eyes. The place covered by the clothes was the kiss mark that had not yet faded from the lovemaking with Xiaoyu the day before. Ningxi wanted to say something else, but Ji Cheng said calmly, "Madam is not feeling well. Send her back to her room first." The ones who took action this time were Ji Cheng's men. The surroundings cleared quickly. My jaw suddenly tightened. Ji Cheng grabbed her and lifted her up forcefully. His voice was terribly cold. "Tell me, who is it?" I looked up and suddenly felt a little ridiculous. Men can have 3 wives and 4 concubines, but women have to stay in the inner house and maintain an inexplicable chastity. Ji Cheng, are you embarrassed to ask me? If your good wife hadn't given me the love potion, would I be like this now? I'm crazy. He just wanted to embarrass Ji Cheng, even at the cost of his life. A deep sarcasm flashed in his eyes, and he suddenly said without thinking, I wonder why you are in such a hurry to divorce me, you bastard. These 2 words stimulated me. I turned my head and slapped him in the face. You are a jerk. The most disgusting jerk. Ji Cheng's eyes were icy cold, as if he was trying hard to hold back his anger. Fine, don't splash dirty water on Ning. I spat at him. Ji Cheng's men lowered their heads desperately, fearing that they would see him being humiliated. He may have forgotten that I used to have a bad temper as well. It's hard to appease him when he gets noisy. Ji Cheng sneered, and the only trace of affection in his eyes disappeared without a trace. Yun Shang, which concubine doesn't accompany guests? I'll just treat you as being licked by a dog, which is just worthy of your status.
Bang.
I slapped him hard again. Trembling with anger, Ji Cheng stopped talking. He stared at the bluestone bricks for a long while, then whispered, I will send someone to investigate. From now on, you will never step out of the general's mansion. I laughed angrily. What if I said that person was a royal relative? Would you dare to kill him? Really? He said with contempt in his eyes. Then come with me to meet His Majesty, so that you will give up. Ji Cheng was really angry this time and pulled me straight to use study. He had military achievements to his name, so he acted in a rather flamboyant manner. Xiaoyu was discussing matters in the study when he was suddenly interrupted by Ji Cheng, but he was not angry. Hey, General Ji is in a good mood today. Did he take his wife to the palace to see the scenery? Ji Cheng lifted his robe and knelt down neatly. Your Majesty, I would like to ask you to do justice. Oh, justice. After Xiaoyu finished speaking, he laughed softly and said, Tell me about it first. Ji Cheng dragged me in front of Xiaoyu and said, Yun is having an affair with a royal relative. I beg your Majesty to find out the identity of the adulterer and enforce the law. Xiaoyu was obviously in a good mood and asked in a playful tone, Royal relatives? Is that what she told you? Yes. But I remember clearly that General Ji was very affectionate yesterday and asked me to give Suoningshi a status. What about Yun Shang? Do you want to control it? She is my first wife, so she should behave like a wife. You are quite lenient. Xiaoyu snorted, leaned lazily on the dragon chair, and looked at me with his head tilted. Little madam, what do you think? I choked, turned my head away, and said, I want a divorce. Ji Cheng grabbed my wrist with such force that it seemed as if he was going to crush my bones. Don't even think about it.
When?
A dagger flew past Ji Cheng's wrist and stabbed into the pillar behind him. Xiaoyu finally turned cold and said, I approve the divorce. The veins on Ji Cheng's forehead bulged with anger. The kiss mark on her neck is proof that your Majesty's handling of the matter was unfair. If this gets out. What if it gets out? Xiaoyu raised his eyelids and smiled coldly. I bit that place. If you are not afraid of death, tell me about it.
8.
Ji Cheng was stunned at first, then his face turned pale. Looked at me suddenly. Last night. Xiaoyu said slowly. Last night. Oh, you mean I and Shang Shang. We were very happy. I lowered my head, clutched the hem of my skirt tightly, and said nothing with a sullen face. Shang Shang can say nice things and act coquettishly, he laughed. Ji Cheng, but she's no better than your barbarian princess. His Majesty. Ji Cheng raised his voice, eyes full of humiliation. She is my first wife. Xiaoyu's eyes were frozen. Since she was your first wife, why did you demote her to a concubine? Who accompanied you to the palace last night? Who was in charge of the food in the palace? Ji Cheng, if you treated her as your first wife, how come you couldn't even find out who poisoned her with the Hahuan powder? Is it that you can't find out? Or do you not want to find out? The series of questions left Ji Cheng speechless. The color on his face disappeared completely. Your Majesty. Xiaoyu refused to let him off. I actually like the person you despise. She is just stubborn. If you don't give her a divorce letter, she will come back again and again. Even the imperial edict is useless. It is better to do it now than to wait for a day. General Ji, sign the divorce agreement, and I will take good care of her and never bother you again. Ji Cheng wanted to say something, but Xiaoyu smiled coldly and said, I am not discussing this with you. For a moment, Ji Cheng looked at Xiaoyu with unwillingness in his eyes. It was just a very brief moment, then he lowered his eyes. He clenched his fists so tightly that the veins on the back of his hands were exposed. Your Majesty, I obey your order. I finally got Ji Cheng's divorce letter and also got my mother's belongings back.
He left.
Xiaoyu and I were the only ones left in the room. Xiaoyu tapped the table lightly. Shang, come here. I came to him obediently. Xiaoyu put down his pen and asked patiently, Did you want to run just now? I glanced at him cautiously and said, Yeah. Are you worried that I don't have the real power and can't protect you? After a moment of silence, he suddenly pinched my chin and looked at me. He laughed and said, How come you are like a puppy with so many injuries from a fight? He rubbed the ointment and applied it to the places where I was scratched by the old women. I stared at his fingertips. Even her fingertips exude a sense of nobility. Why does she choose me for her own preference? Xiaoyu lowered his eyes and said indifferently, Keep your heart in your heart. Even if I soak them all, I will never let them soak you. I remained silent for a long time and just did whatever he told me to do. Xiaoyu laughed out loud. You are well behaved today. Give me a kiss. I miss you so much after not seeing you for a day. There's someone outside. You want them to see? Then I'll hold you and go to the window. I muttered to myself for a while, and Xiaoyu smiled and said, What a noisy woman. After saying that, he carried me into the inner room. I don't know, Ji Cheng didn't leave. Instead, he stood outside the door and took in everything that happened. He stared at her unwillingly for a while before leaving. 9. That day, I slept soundly on Xiaoyu's bed. Perhaps he was tortured and had a high fever. I feel dazed all day long. Xiaoyu personally took care of it. It took several days for me to recover. Xiaoyu saw that I was always listless, so he called all the civil and military officials to accompany me in the autumn hunt. The autumn breeze brings coolness. The green blanket on the mountain has turned yellow. I was wearing a veil, sitting on a high platform, and saw Ji Cheng and Suoningshi. Suoningshi is now taken care of by Ji Cheng like a proudly blooming peony. In an instant, Ji Cheng seemed to sense something and looked over. Eyes met. Ji Cheng turned his eyes away expressionlessly. Place the freshly peeled blanched shrimp in a bowl. Shang, eat meat.
Xiaoyu called me.
I lowered my head and picked up the small pieces of meat in the bowl to eat. These days, everyone treats me as Ji Cheng's cousin. Everyone thought that Ji Cheng was going to be very successful and congratulated him at the banquet. Ji Cheng raised his cup and said to Xiaoyu, I would like to congratulate your majesty for finding such a good match. The two lines of sight intertwined in the air, sparks flying everywhere. Xiaoyu smiled and said, If she and I had met a few years earlier, we would probably have had children by now. Ji Cheng's expression froze. Mrs. Yun and I have been in love for many years, and we did have sex a few times. But she was not in good health, so she died. What a pity. Xiaoyu smiled coldly. General Ji, why don't you check your body? After 3 rounds of drinking, everyone was in high spirits and rode their horses deep into the dense forest. I was held in Xiaoyu's arms. He just shouted, Catch a brown bear and you'll get a reward. Then he said to Ji Cheng, who was standing nearby, Shang is in need of a cloak. I heard fox fur is good. General Ji will be glad to have it. Ji Cheng's eyes were dim. Your Majesty, I will do my best. He did not take Siningsi with him and rode into the bushes alone, armed with a gun. But Xiaoyu didn't leave. He held me in his arms, standing there, drawing his bow and drawing his arrow. The next moment, the bow was fully drawn and the arrow pointed directly at Ji Cheng's back. I was terrified. What do you want? Feeling bad? Xiaoyu said with a sour tone. You looked at him several times just now. You even drank a few more glasses of wine. I was. I racked my brains, but couldn't think of anything nice to say. Growing up, I would drink whenever I was nervous. Xiaoyu let go. The arrow flew towards Ji Cheng's back. I was so scared that my heart stopped. If Ji Cheng died, the army would be in chaos, and everything would be in chaos. Ji Cheng. With a dang sound, the arrow grazed Ji Cheng's arm and pierced deep into the tree trunk. A dead rabbit was also nailed to the ground. Ji Cheng turned around, his face darkened. Your Majesty, what do you mean? Xiaoyu walked over slowly. Shang wanted a little rabbit, which surprised General Ji. I was so frightened that I nearly fell off my horse. Xiaoyu was quick to catch me and whisper in my ear. Warm breath penetrated into my ears. If you don't want him to die, then please me. In panic, I held his lips and moved forward. Xiaoyu didn't move at first, letting me go all out on his lips. To embarrass me, when I was at a loss and ready to give up, he suddenly pressed me into his arms and said loudly, General Ji, this rabbit is a reward for you. Having said this, he pulled up the reins, leaped on his horse, and headed into the depths.
10.
Slow down. Apart from my cries and pleas, the only sound was the hunting wind in the forest. Xiaoyu did not slow down his horse, but ran faster and faster. He was really angry because of what I shouted at him just now. He took me on a quick ride to a lake. He tied the horse to a tree, dismounted, and walked toward the lake. I lay on the horse's back and stretched my legs, but they were too high to reach the stirrups. His Majesty. Xiaoyu turned a deaf ear. I gritted my teeth and hurriedly slipped off the horse. I sprained my ankle. Then he chased after him, taking one step forward and one step back. Are you angry? Xiaoyu gave me a sidelong glance and asked, What do you think? Is he acquainted with me or not? He is sincere to you. So whose side are you on? I blinked and said, I hope you're okay. Xiaoyu narrowed his eyes. Yunshang, how dare you say such perfunctory words? I pulled his sleeve and took a deep breath. I'm from the north, and I know how hard life is for the people during the war. As long as the inheritance lasts, peace in the north will last. Xiaoyu's eyes moved slightly. Is this why you don't argue with Ji Cheng? I felt a little disappointed. I know which is more important, personal feelings or the interests of the country. He certainly has done me wrong, but as long as he is good to the people, he cannot die. They all say you are a tyrant, but I know you review documents until late at night, devoting all your energy to the affairs of your country. I hope you live a long life too. Xiaoyu lowered his head and touched my ear, his eyes unclear. Can you really swallow the grievance? I choked up and said, Even if I can't swallow it, I have to swallow it. If only one of me and Ji Cheng can survive, what will you choose? He asked again. I frowned in confusion and said nothing for a long time. Xiaoyu's originally mild expression suddenly returned to normal. He picked me up and threw me onto the horse. In my opinion, it's useless to ask you. I'd rather do something interesting with you. My collar loosened and I grabbed him tightly in fear. Don't. Shang, hold on tight. If you fall, I won't save you. That night, Xiaoyu was particularly ruthless. A strong boy and Ji Cheng. In every aspect, she is stronger than him, more gentle than him, and can last longer than him. It's his fault that he couldn't keep the baby. I'm different. Shang, do you like me more or Ji Cheng? I steadied myself tremblingly and said, You? It's hot in the house. Xiaoyu's hands were cool. He touched my hot face and said softly, Look up and call for help. I felt like I was melting. Your Majesty, call me by my name. Thank you, you. 11. When he returned that day, Xiaoyu suddenly became busy. Due to my inconvenient status, I can only stay in the palace every day and listen to the palace maids talk about the latest news outside the palace. I heard that Suan Ningxi is living a comfortable life now because she is pregnant and Ji Cheng is very obedient to her. I heard that the situation in the north is not peaceful and General Ji is going to go to war again. I was stunned. When did it happen? Just a few days ago, the North unilaterally tore up the treaty and started the war. I sat by the window for a whole day, and in the evening, Xiaoyu came back. He seemed to be ill and not feeling well, coughing all the time. I sneaked out and asked the chief eunuch, "What happened to your majesty these days?" "Well, it's all because of General Ji's expedition." The chief eunuch looked at me with embarrassment. "Your majesty and General Ji have a disagreement over who to send to the battle. He has not slept for several days and has caught a cold. Your majesty, I think you still have some influence in front of General Ji. Otherwise, you go and persuade him." I heard that Ji Cheng has been living in the side halls on both sides of Yu's study these days. He resolutely refused to lead the troops into battle. Since Xiaoyu did not agree to be replaced, he refused to leave. I stared at Xiaoyu quietly. He smiled, and his eyes and brows looked very beautiful under the candlelight. "What are you looking at me for? Is Ji Cheng unwilling to go to war?" Xiaoyu paused as he untied his sleeves and said, "I thought you were thinking about me, but you were thinking about him? I miss you." My ears turned red, and I accidentally told the truth. He grabbed me and asked sinisterly, "Do you still want to sleep tonight?" I shrunk my neck and said, "You are ill. Please don't let me get sick." Xiaoyu laughed angrily. "You are such a heartless kid. If I die in the future, you'll be the first one to run away. Come here, I'll hold you in my arms to sleep tonight." I looked embarrassed and said, "Forget it. I don't want to get sick." Xiaoyu choked. "Do you really hate it?" I said nothing and took a few steps back. Xiaoyu laughed and scolded, "Virtue." He washed up and went to bed. I listened to his breathing becoming gradually regular, quietly got up from the bed, dressed myself, and went to the side hall. Ji Cheng was wearing court robes and sitting in a corner. Hearing the movement, he raised his head slightly. Those dim eyes let in a little light, reflecting my figure. He sat still. He twirled his fingertips and shouted, "Chong Shong." I sat down opposite him and asked, "Why is General Ji unwilling to lead his troops into battle?" Ji Cheng's expression tensed. "Have we become so estranged?" I ignored him and asked, "Is it because of Suaningshi?" Ji Cheng pursed his lips. "Yes. Ninger doesn't want me to harm her people." My hands gradually tightened. I stood up, walked in front of Ji Cheng, and stared at him. At the moment he was about to speak, he suddenly raised his hand and slapped him hard in the face. The resounding sound of the slap echoed throughout the side hall. Ji Cheng was stunned. I said, "Ji Cheng, you can forget the promise you made to me, but don't forget the hundreds of lives you are responsible for." His eyes trembled. "You. Back then, all my clan members died under the blades of the enemy in order to save your life. You said you wanted to be a general and defend your country. You said that you wanted to prevent the barbarians from ever setting foot in the Central Plains again, so I traveled thousands of miles with you to the capital." Ji Cheng's face turned pale. "Shang Shang." I said angrily, "You married Siningshi for the sake of peace between the two countries. I didn't make trouble. Now you refuse to go to war for Suaningshi, so I will kill Suaningshi. You have to go to this battlefield even if you don't want to." My eyes were red, and I turned to the door and said, "Someone, bring Suaningshi here." The royal guards waiting outside responded in unison, "Yes." Ji Cheng stood up suddenly. "How dare you?" I stared at him with burning eyes and spoke fiercely. "Your Majesty is afraid of being criticized, but I am not. I am just a woman, and if I kill Suaningshi out of jealousy, I will only die." Ji Cheng, think it over carefully." Ji Cheng didn't say a word for a long time. At this moment, all of Xiaoyu's royal guards stood behind me. "Just wait for my order and then rush into the general's mansion to arrest him." Ji Cheng bit his back teeth tightly. "Yun Shang, you're very good. You don't care about the relationship we have had for several years." I pretended not to hear anything and walked out of the side hall without looking back. "There is no point in talking anymore. Please, General." The chief eunuch was pleased. "Your Majesty is very brave." Now I say this. The civil and military officials in the court will say nothing more. But after today, I have completely broken off relations with Ji Cheng, and perhaps I can no longer hide my identity. I endured the dizziness and said, "Go and bring Suoningshi into the palace and tell her that I want her to come in and talk to me." Yes.
12.
The night Suoningshi entered the palace, Ji Cheng went to war. After a while, someone came to report, "Madam, the general's wife is here." After half a month, I heard this title again, and I couldn't help but feel dazed for a moment. Then, Suoningshi's voice was heard. "My general is related to the empress. Please show mercy and allow him to stay in the capital to accompany the birth for the sake of the general." The chief eunuch asked for my opinion, and I nodded and let her in. Suoningshi pushed through the crowd and came in. "My lady." Her words suddenly got stuck in her throat. When she saw me, she suddenly changed her tone and spoke in a stiff voice. "Why you? It was you who stopped him from going to the war?" I asked. Suoningshi's flattering expression just now disappeared, and he raised his chin arrogantly. "So, what if it's me? The general pampers me and is willing to resign for me. Isn't this something you can't envy?" I stared at her and said softly, "Slap her face." "Someone will do it for me." Suoningshi received a solid slap in the face and stared at me fiercely. "I am a princess. How dare you hit me? Slap your face."
Bang.
Another slap. "Yun Shang, you little slave, you." I looked up at her face and said, "It is a capital crime to stop our generals from going to war. If you dare to pretend to be a princess of the enemy country when the two countries go to war, it is also a capital crime. Beating you is already a great bargain for you." Suoningshi suddenly jumped up and tried to rush over, being held by a group of people. Her eyes were red, as if she was looking at the enemy who killed her father. "Yun Shang, just wait for the general to return triumphantly. Then he will definitely avenge me." After these words were spoken, a group of people showed contempt. To inherit the victory meant the defeat of her motherland. One second she was pleading for her motherland, and the next second she hoped that her motherland would be a stepping stone for her husband. No one respects this kind of spineless fence-sitter. I was exhausted and ordered, "Watch him closely, don't let anything go wrong, and shut his mouth." Until the last moment before leaving, Suoningshi was still insulting me. I returned to my bedroom, took off my hairpins, and stared at myself in the mirror. I remember many years ago, Ji Cheng held me in his arms and hid in the ruins. Outside the gap, blood flowed like a river. My relatives were ripped open by the barbarians' long knives. That group of people took pleasure in desecrating corpses all day long. At that time, I swore that one day, I would watch them perish. When Ji Cheng participated in the military exercise, I got up early and worked late to make porridge and rice for him, afraid that I won't get enough nutrients. I cherish my life because I am afraid that I will not see them die. When lying on the bed, Xiaoyu moved. The quilt was immediately filled with the scent of my flowers. "Can you vent your anger?" Xiaoyu closed his eyes and held me in his arms. "Your hands are cold after staying here for so long. You know all of this? I have listened to your dreams until my ears are tangled." My nose felt sore, and I hugged him tightly without saying a word for a long time. "Stop crying," Xiaoyu said. "I have always protected you, and I still do so now." It was raining outside the window, and the rainy night was cold. I vaguely recalled the happy times I had with my parents and brothers in the north. Because what happened later was so tragic, I have forgotten that memory deep in my memory. I only remember that the one who protected me at that time was Ji Cheng. Now, it's another person. 13. The weather turned colder, and the war in the north became more intense. During this period, Suoningshi made trouble several times. No one paid any attention. When winter came, good news came from the north. The battle was won. The dead air among the civil and military officials in the court was swept away in an instant. Looking forward to the triumphant return of the army every day. "Your Majesty, the general's wife has become more and more crazy these days. She keeps telling you to regret it." I thought she was talking crazy. Who would have thought that on this day, when I was accompanying Xiaoyu to read the memorials, an urgent message suddenly came. General Ji is missing. Xiaoyu frowned slightly. What do you mean disappeared? The army was passing through Ion Jade Pass, but the heavy rains caused the river bank to collapse. The general fell into the river and was washed away. The messenger paused for a moment and said, "The rumor in the army is that." "What is it?" "Your Majesty took the general's wife, and the general, out of shame and anger, sought death."
Click.
The brush in my hand suddenly fell onto the paper. A look of confusion. How could he possibly seek death for me? Xiaoyu glanced at me calmly and said, "Nonsense." But that night, all the old ministers knelt in front of the hall, filled with indignation. "I beg your Majesty to execute the evil concubine, to comfort the army." Accompanying them were many soldiers returning from the battlefield. Very powerful. He acted as if this matter would not be over until he died. My identity was therefore exposed to the public. Suaningshi laughed like crazy and kept yelling in the hall, "Yunshang, wait for death." Ji Cheng's deputy general knelt in front of the palace, crying. The general relied on the intelligence provided by his wife to inflict heavy damage on the enemy. However, the evil concubine imprisoned his wife in the palace due to a personal grudge. If she doesn't give us an explanation for this, the public will be furious. I sat in the temple, listening to the loud cries outside, and felt chilled all over. Xiaoyu went to the front to discuss countermeasures with others. Before leaving, he touched my hair and said, "Don't panic. This has nothing to do with you." But how can it have nothing to do with me? But I don't want to escape. This battle was a great victory. In the next few decades, the power of the Central Plains would slowly disintegrate them. Great revenge. The night watch drum outside the window has already sounded 3 times. Suddenly, a man fell down from the beam. Before I could utter a word, someone covered my mouth. "It's me." The sudden sound made me give up struggling instantly, and I stared at the person who came and pulled down the dough in astonishment. It is Ji Cheng. He was intact, eyes sparkling. How does he look like a dead person? "I'm here to take you away." He pulled out the trigger pin in my hair and pulled me up. Someone behind me said, "General, the princess has been rescued safely." Well, retreat. I had a bad feeling in my heart. "Ji Cheng, explain to me what is going on." Ji Cheng paused. "The palace is going to be in chaos. For the sake of our past friendship, I will save your life. Shang, as long as you are willing to go with me, I will let bygones be bygones." I suddenly pulled my hand away. "Are you going to rebel?" Ji Cheng's expression was gloomy. "Ninger is pregnant with my child. For her, I have to do it." I never thought that one day these words would come out of Ji Cheng's mouth. It turned out that his fake death was a setup with Suaningshi. And Suaningshi is a northern barbarian. This is not only a rebellion but also treason. "Ji Cheng, do you still remember where you are from?" Facing my question, Ji Cheng's face turned cold. Shang, you will be buried in the Ji family's ancestral tomb until you die. When I become the emperor in the future, you will be the imperial concubine." There was no mercy in his eyes. Only reluctance remains. And ambitious. If I went with him, it would be a handle that could hinder Xiaoyu. Life and death are determined by fate. I don't want to go with you. Having said that, I lifted up my skirt and rushed out without looking back. "Someone help." As soon as he finished speaking, Ji Cheng covered his mouth tightly. "It's not up to you." 14. The area in front of the main hall is already in chaos. In a state of outrage, the crowd clashed with Xiaoyu's royal guards. Until someone shouted, "The general is still alive." The chaos suddenly stopped. Everyone looked over. Under the silent sky, I was supported by Ji Cheng's long sword as I climbed up the stairs step by step. The murderous aura was thick and overwhelming. Xiaoyu stood behind the royal guards with cold eyes. "Back off, don't hurt her." The royal guards formed a siege, changing the formation of the encirclement as Ji Cheng moved. Ji Cheng said in a slow tone, Your Majesty, our great Xia has suffered heavy losses in this war, and it will be difficult for us to recover within 100 years. I think we should stop the war. However, Your Majesty has been deceived and cannot distinguish right from wrong. You have insulted my wife first and persecuted loyal ministers and generals later. I humbly ask Your Majesty to abdicate and let the throne be given to the wise." Xiaoyu sneered. "General Ji, are you really doing this for the people?" "Yes." "Do you dare to swear to heaven that you have no selfish motives?" "Yes." "What if I don't agree?" His clear and majestic voice echoed in the night. Ji Cheng said, "Then I will boldly make the decision for you." The thousands of archers standing behind him only needed Ji Cheng to give an order, and they would shoot their arrows at once to kill Xiaoyu. He was not afraid at all. Several old ministers hesitated and asked, "Your Majesty is now the only bloodline of the late emperor. Who else could it be besides him?" Suoningshi took out a jade pendant and held it high. "The general is the late emperor's posthumous son, so this is proof." When these words were spoken, the crowd was shocked. Several old officials immediately came forward to determine whether the jade pendant was genuine. After a moment, he knelt down suddenly and said, "This old minister pays respect to His Royal Highness the 16th Prince." The late emperor was a romantic man by nature, and even in his old age, he was still obsessed with romantic matters. After the emperor passed away, a pregnant woman secretly escaped from the palace. The 16th prince is in her belly. The woman was said to be from the north, and coincidentally, Ji Cheng's registered residence was in the north. This coincides with this history. At this moment, Ji Cheng's words became absolutely credible. Suoningshi said, "I am willing to make friends with the general in exchange for 100 years of peace in Daxia." In an instant, the crowd shouted loudly, with waves of voices rising one after another. The calls for forcing Xiaoyu to abdicate became louder. Only a few old ministers looked at each other with some doubt. Just as he was about to say something, he was dragged away and chopped to pieces by Ji Cheng's men. Suoningshi stared at me, the jealousy in his eyes almost overflowing. She would tear me into pieces immediately. But I am the only one who knows that the jade pendant is fake. When we were on the way to Beijing, when we couldn't even afford to eat, we saw a merchant being murdered. Ji Cheng took the risk and stole his bag. The most valuable of them is this jade pendant. He is lying. I was about to open my mouth when I met Xiaoyu's eyes. He shook his head slightly at me, indicating that I should stop talking nonsense. This war is inevitable, and I am useless except being a burden to Xiaoyu. Xiaoyu said, "As long as you release Shang, everything will be fine." Ji Cheng put the knife to my lower back and gnashed his teeth. This woman is really capable. She can serve His Majesty to such an extent that he would even sacrifice his life for it. I ignored the insults and said to Xiaoyu, "In my life, what I hate most is the northern barbarians entering the Central Plains. If one day I become a shield in front of them, I would rather die." Shang, what do you want to do?" There was a flash of panic in Xiaoyu's eyes. When the first skyrocket lights up the night sky, I broke free from Ji Cheng's grip and jumped down the stairs. If you fall from a height of dozens of feet, you will be half crippled, if not dead. I saw Xiaoyu's pale face and his figure rushing towards me. The darkness swallowed me up instantly. I hit a rock or got caught on the halberd and slid all the way into the abyss. I don't want to live. The scene suddenly became chaotic. The two sides clashed with their weapons, and arrows rained down from the sky, attached to flames, and flew towards the buildings. Smoke of war rose everywhere. Blood rained down. I finally fell on a tilted stone wall, looking helplessly at the bright red night. The battle lasted all night long, with the sound of killing deafening. I saw the piles of corpses falling down, and suddenly I started to tremble all over. Those dusty memories came flooding back like a tide. When I was a child, I followed that person, jumping and skipping. "Brother Au, why are you always looking at the capital?" "Because it's my home." "Why don't you go back?" "I can't go back." "Why can't I go back?" Xiaoyu, who looked much younger, held a piece of grass in his mouth and said with a smile, How can a little radish have so much? Do you want some candy? Think. Kiss brother you, and I'll buy you some candy. At that time, I followed him around the streets. The north is the fertile soil that nourishes our growth. Later one day, Xiaoyu picked me up and asked, Brother Yu is going to the capital. Will you miss me after he leaves? I burst into tears when I heard that and hugged him tightly. Xiaoyu smiled happily. I understand. When you grow up, come to the capital and brother Yu will marry you. The figure I always think of is actually Xiaoyu. Later, I lay on the hillside and looked at the capital. When I was 12, I was caught in the rain and had a high fever. From then on, my brain became unhealthy. I can't remember clearly. Later, Ji Cheng came to my house. I gradually superimposed that figure on Ji Cheng's body. No wonder. When I first went to Beijing to meet the emperor, Xia, you gave me many gifts. He also said, Madam, now that you are married, you should live a good life. I cried and tried hard to climb out from under the messy stairs. I would like to take one last look at Xiaoyu, even just a glance. It was dawn. A thin glimmer of light was scattered on the earth. In front of the main hall, corpses were scattered everywhere. The bright yellow figure, facing the fierce cold wind, stood under the vast sky with a long sword in hand. The robe was dyed scarlet. Ji Cheng fell in front of him, broke a leg. All around were the royal guards kneeling in a mess. Xiaoyu coughed a few times, suddenly vomited blood, and saw me. Shang. I forced myself to stand up and ran towards him crying. Brother Yu? Xiaoyu looked over, his eyes full of tenderness. Good Shang, you finally remembered your brother? Then his body went limp and he fell down. 3 months later, Empress Suo Ningxi has given birth to a daughter. In early spring, the apricot blossoms outside the window bloomed. I lowered my head and finished sewing the last stitch of the purse. Then I raised my head and asked, Does your Majesty know? Not long ago, Xiaoyu told me, no matter whether you are a man or a woman, all of you will be kept as hostages in the capital. The maid replied, Your Majesty has gone to the prison. I was badly injured in the last battle. Every time I woke up in pain at night, it kept Xiaoyu busy for a while. The next day, he would definitely go to the prison to express his condolences. I stretched my stiff body and went to the heavenly prison to look for Xiaoyu for the first time. A small lamp makes the prison seem gloomy and terrifying. I was led to the end of the path. The voices of Ji Cheng and Xiaoyu talking came into my ears. Now Xiaoyu has revealed nothing at all, sitting in front of Ji Cheng, telling him how good I am. You stole my credit and tricked her into falling in love with me. I have to divorce you before I can have sex with you. You are really capable. Ji Cheng's voice was hoarse as he was tied to the rack. It is despicable to take someone's wife. So, what if you are despicable? If you have the guts, you can sit on the throne. The palace maid stopped in front of me and wouldn't let me take another step. Your Majesty is pregnant. Please take care of yourself. The conversation inside paused, and Xiaoyu walked out in a flash. The cold frost on her body faded away, and she smiled. Shang, why are you in the mood to come look for me today? He is getting more handsome now. Smiling can make your heart beat faster. I remembered that I had an argument with him last night, and I should not say a word to him at this moment, so I pursed my lips and said nothing. Xiaoyu asked, Are you still angry because I called you the wrong name? That's a geese, not a water duck. I corrected it again. Yes, brother Au has poor eyesight, but Shang has good hands. I turned around and walked in front, and Xiaoyu followed behind. He walked out of the prison and got on the carriage back to the palace. Now, the jade pendant has been returned to its original owner and is hanging around Xiaoyu's waist. Ji Cheng waited for execution in autumn. Suo Ningxi was abandoned by her motherland and committed suicide the day after giving birth. I played with the jade pendant on Xiaoyu's waist and asked, How did you lose it when you went to Beijing? I was robbed. Xiaoyu answered calmly, but I knew he had a deep scar on his lower back. It almost cost him his life. I rested my head on his chest, listening to his strong heartbeat, and said, Then how can they prove that you are the prince? Xiaoyu smiled slowly. When the 13th brother passed away, his mother was afraid that she would lose her glory and wealth, so she asked me to take over. The wounds on your body. Of course she hit me. Xiaoyu seemed to be afraid that I didn't understand, and added, "It hurt a lot." I was silent, lowered my head, and silently held his fingers and rubbed them, because I suddenly remembered why Xiaoyu came to Beijing. There was a snowstorm that year, and our family had no harvest. I squatted by the wall, hugged Xiaoyu, and cried in the middle of the night. I said, "Brother Ayu, it would be great if I could get to know the emperor. I want to eat my fill and never be hungry again." Xiaoyu touched my head and sighed. "Then, brother Yu, how about becoming the emperor?" "Real. Real. That's great."
Click.
A tear fell. Xiaoyu paused and hugged me. "Why are you crying?" "I didn't scold you." After hearing this, I cried even harder. "Are you stupid? How can you sacrifice your whole life because of a joke?" Xiaoyu said, "How can it be called a joke?" I remember everything Shang said. When Xiaoyu had just finished fighting, everyone thought he was going to die. Several officials forced me to be buried with him. At that time, I cried all day and squatted at his bedside, talking to him all day long. "Brother Ayu, I don't want to die." After muttering for 3 days, Xiaoyu suddenly put his hand on my head, touched it, and said in a hoarse voice, "Which bastard dares to let my Shang be buried with him?" He opened his eyes and said, "When I arrived at King Yan's palace, I heard Shang crying, so I came back." Just as he recovered, several ministers started to find fault again, saying that I am not worthy of my position. A married woman cannot become a queen. He was fined by Xiaoyu and locked up in his mansion to reflect on his mistakes. The carriage rumbled into the palace gate, and I sighed. I wish I didn't marry Ji Cheng. Xiaoyu lowered his eyes. "If you and he were living well, you could have let him go. But after seeing him like that, I couldn't bear to let him go." Shang, that time you pushed me down on the bed," Xiaoyu said softly. "I was so happy that I went crazy. But they all say you." Xiaoyu chuckled. "What are you talking about? I just like you no matter what." My heart trembled, and suddenly I had a bold idea. "Brother Ayu." What?" My face turned red, and I whispered in his ear, "Can I consummate your marriage?" Xiaoyu took a deep breath and asked, "How can I make up for it?" I was too sloppy the first time. "There's something I never said." I whispered in his ear for a while. Xiaoyu groaned, held my hand tightly, and said in a hoarse voice, "Say it again." "Brother Ayu, I love you." End of full text.